we are live with our first LinkedIn Live broadcast. Hello, Billy.
Hey there, Walt. How you doing?
I'm doing great. So I'm excited. This is our first opportunity to talk in a live stream.
Yeah, and I'm. Of course, it may be boring. I'm not very opinionated or anything. So.
Oh, yes. Right. Um, so I thought we'd start by talking about the philosophy and why you and I have done so much desktop development at the beginning. So let's first talk about what is a desktop application. That definition, I think, has really changed over time. Back in the day, when I started building desktop applications, they were monolithic applications where the entire code ran inside the executable. But I don't think that's necessarily the case anymore.
Oh no, I think from my perspective, I began going to more tiered-based development about 1995, where we would break down into the data layer, and then there was some facade to the data layer, and then there was the part that ran in front of it. That was hard to do until Java and .NET came along, so that we could actually have good object-oriented technologies to implement those layers. But by, let's call it 2001, that myself and all the projects I worked on had completely made the transition to layered architecture. And to me, the beauty of that is now you've got a lot of the stuff that's concerned with what really goes on in the app, but working on the server, and we could actually have multiple forms of UI. Starting about 2004, we would do UI that was desktop for the high productivity employees, and we would do a mobile app to check inventory and things like that, and then we would do a web app for consumers to come in and do things. So yeah, it has changed quite a bit from those very first. I remember some of the character-based stuff that I did was just all up in like a 60K exe or something.
Right, and I think with the cloud, and the way we think about distributed portions of the application now, I think that's nobody writes an application anymore that's entirely within the executable, with some minor exceptions, maybe a console application.
Yeah.
Like we've always had separation in databases and things like that. So I was trying to get my idea when I was like, well, it's a desktop show, but you and I tend to concentrate more on the UI development part of it. So like the smart client or the client. Is that really what we're going to be talking about in the show?
Yeah, I think so. It's using native platforms to do things that are impractical, or in some cases really not possible, using more generic web-based technologies. Certainly, and I think philosophically speaking, I don't want anybody to get the idea that I don't think you should be doing web development. I'm actually find that web development is probably, in most companies, a bigger portion of what they do than what they do on native platforms. But it shouldn't be the only option, especially as I talk about the layered stuff. Having multiple things that talk to those business layers is quite practical. So for me, the borderline of between, let's say, native and what goes on, or rather what goes on the desktop and what goes on a tablet, that's a little bit fuzzy because it uses a lot of the same technologies. To me, when you talk about desktop development, you're talking about more advanced forms of input. You're talking about use of state to do things. You're talking about assembling the UI from controls that you put in some kind of a layout. And so those are kind of conceptual differences from how you do things on the web, which give us more flexibility, but also give us some more restricted reach. So there are certainly places where that fits, and there are places that it doesn't.
Yes. So would you consider a console application to be a desktop application?
I guess I would, but outside of internal kind of IT things, how many of those do we produce for users? I mean, for me, the desktop is really about the users. That's the reason I want to get all that additional flexibility to do things. So console apps are fine, and I've written a few, but I don't think about them as being primarily the reason you do desktop stuff.
Because one of the things I think about is when people say, well, why would you do Windows development or desktop development? What advantages did it have? And one, to me, is utilities, right? The kinds of utilities that an IT department needs or a company needs. Now, PowerShell has changed the formula a lot because with the inclusion of managed code in PowerShell, we can write scripts that are a lot like, a C# application. So maybe it's less so, but I still would consider that an example of a desktop application. And one of the things that you can leverage that's harder to do in a browser application or a mobile application. A mobile application you can't run on your desktop and have it like do a batch process of a bunch of files.
Yeah, that's a fair statement. I mean, that's kind of a general idea of when you're working on native platforms, there are various things that you can get a hold of in the native environment that's hard to get a hold of if you're running just in a generic browser. They come up with various toolkits to get to standard things like cameras and such, but to get to every resource that's available, that's a fair statement. That's one of the reasons to do desktop development. But honestly, for the kind of corporate applications we tend to do desktop, or the what's even more popular in our client base is applications that are built for resale. There are various scenarios in which you need to use native technologies and make it more of a desktop app. For example, having the database local to the machine because you don't have a continuous online thing is a reason, because maybe your connectivity isn't good enough to do that.
So you're saying something like a warehouse application or a manufacturing floor app where you've got an isolated PC on the manufacturing floor?
That's an example. That would be kind of the corporate situation, or that could be a software package as well. But I think of one of our clients that sells an application for managing propane distribution. If you've got a little shop, and of course, because of the physical nature of delivering propane, there's a little company that does this in every little town practically in the U.S. And inside that company, you might not have the kind of connectivity you'd like. So having the database local to that shop because look, in January in Minnesota, if you can't deliver propane to the little old ladies, I mean, that's a life-threatening situation. So you need a level of reliability, and you need control and such. That's hard to get when you're doing things across the wire. So that's
I would say also that we're learning in this whole work from home and the fact that we're all hammering the internet is that it's wonderful to have a connection to a database on the cloud, let's say SQL Server running in Azure. But on the other hand, when your connectivity dwindles to nothing because everybody's using the internet, what do you do?
And of course, there are certain things that just local bandwidth makes practical, because if you're out in some town in northern Idaho or something, you probably don't have gigabit fiber to the local businesses. I mean, I do here. If you kind of look in the background, they can probably see there's my. No, it's just off the side. You can't quite see it. My AT&T router. I have gigabit fiber here into my home office, but that's a lot.
And you're in Tennessee?
I'm in Nashville, Tennessee. Yeah, about 10 minutes south of downtown in Nashville. And Nashville, it turns out, has been a communication hub for a long time. So we were some of the earliest to get some good broadband stuff. But yeah,
that's nice.
Gigabit fiber into the house. I love that.
Yeah. So, Billy, I was trying to think when we first met. It's got to be almost 20 years ago.
It was the early 2000s, doing some of the conference stuff. I recall going to Australia to a conference. This would have been.
That was a VS Live. Yes.
And sharing a cab from the airport over to the Hyatt where we held the conference. So yeah, quite a long time. And
I also remember we went to somebody's house for a dinner. And we were there was like six of us in the cab heading out there.
Yeah, that would have been Adam Kogan.
Right, Adam's house.
That was down on he has a shore house, with a beach house, I guess you'd say. It's a couple layers up from the beach, but Sydney sort of goes uphill, so you have this beautiful view of the ocean. Yeah, I remember that quite well.
Yeah. So one of the things I've noticed, I mean, you've written books, you've talked a lot about software development, you've thought about coding, but you've always been a consistent advocate for building rich and engaging and useful applications. So I was curious what motivated you to start working with UI as opposed to the databases or the backends?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's hard to remember exactly when this hit me, but it was sometime in the 80s when, see, well, I think the best place to start is to understand that I don't really like to write code. And I'm not interested in technology for technology's sake. Technology has always been something to help me solve problems for people. I find myself being much more people-centric, which means user-centric in many cases, than a lot of people in the industry. And I noticed that even back in the 80s, because we were sticking these character-based apps at 24 by 40. Well, I got a Microsoft mouse in, oh, I don't know, it was probably about 84. It had green buttons, the very first generation of Microsoft mouse. So I got toolkits to do mouse-based software, even with character-based things. You know, it might be an interesting thing for a future show for me to dig out some of those old programs, because I still got them. As you said, they're EXEs, they just run. And I was doing things from a UI perspective, even then, that most of the people around me just weren't interested in doing. I remember very clearly one of the best comparisons in that era was between WordPerfect and Microsoft Word. And WordPerfect was the dominant word processor in that era. But I rejected it out of hand because everything was keyboard based. They didn't do anything with mice. They had already said they weren't going to do anything with graphics. And so I adopted Microsoft Word, and I had all the WordPerfect people go, "Hey, you're missing the boat here."
So for you, the reason you wanted to use that tool and the reason you wanted to use Word and Excel was because of the graphic nature of it?
Well, the graphic nature when they got to there, but originally it was being able to do things with the mouse. If I'm going to select text, I'm sorry, it's just a whole lot easier to do it with a mouse than it is with a bunch of keystrokes. So yeah, I got started then, and I started writing my own software. I put mouse-based stuff into it, and I got Visual Basic the day it was released at Comdex Atlanta. I stood in line and paid my 99 bucks and got it, and realized this is a technology that basically lets my imagination run quite a bit more free. And every generation of technology since then has done better at that, from VB to Windows Forms to XAML. And when I tell people these days, when you're designing your app, why in the world are you going to some wireframing or prototyping tool? You ought to be sketching things out on paper, because if you can draw it, you can probably build it. And so for me, seeing a user's jaw drop because they're amazed at the UI that we produced, or seeing them smile and go, "Yeah, that's a great way to do it," I gain much more satisfaction out of that than I do writing some elegant piece of code.
Nice. So I know that you're a advocate for good user experience in an application. So can you explain how you think about user experience versus user interface or UI, and what's the difference to you?
Well, I mean, they're very related. The user experience is the overall flow of everything that happens in the user trying to accomplish a task. And so there are elements of the design that don't have anything to do specifically with the interface. We might change the flow of the work that somebody does so that it's a better experience, and you don't necessarily see that on the screen. The UI is more about the layout and making sure you understand what you're doing, that it makes sense. Well, I'll give you a great example in the sense that even back in classic VB days, people could call out information they could make things bigger that were important. But how many VBFs did you see that actually did that? Can you think of one?
No.
Yeah, see, nobody did it. We did a little bit of that. And so that's the sort of thing that makes a user interface better, and it improves the user experience in the sense that as they're talking to the customer and they see they need a critical piece of information, they see it and it's nice, it's big. You know, it's probably good. Let's see if I can't find a slide that kind of illustrates that, because you don't have to share my screen quite yet, because I'll have to nail this thing down. Okay.
Okay. I'll take over from here.
Yeah.
For those that are joining us, this is our first live broadcast on LinkedIn Live, and also I'm still learning the application that we're using for streaming. It's called StreamYard. a great tool, and I recommend it, but learning how to navigate while you're hosting a live cast and also switching screens is a learning experience. But that's why I like teaching. I like learning things and figuring out how to explain it. While Billy's looking at that, my experience on desktop, for me, I was fascinated with computers, like many of us that got into the programming, but I was also really fascinated with the graphics side of it. And I remember getting to work on an Apple II. I think it was Apple II GS, and the fact that it had a great graphic system and that it was programmable, I thought was fascinating, and that I wanted to be able to control what was on the screen, and not just, I hadn't even thought about user interfaces yet. The fact that you could put controls on there and have it interact with the user, but just the fact that could I make a red pixel move around on the screen was endlessly fascinating to me. And then, of course, that translated into building user interfaces with Windows Forms, and then, of course, WPF came out. How you doing there, Billy?
I've got the screen up, so I can kind of talk about some of the things that, to me, we talk about size. Look how nice and big this is. That there are 17 days since the last delivery. That's really easy for somebody to see. The titles and such. This location is home. This location is the shop. There's more information in a smaller place, but the stuff that needs to be called out is called out. So this is from a course that I do on UX. Call it some of the ways that modern technology can help us. I mean, you talk about the graphics. Look at the smiley face over there. Our brains are made to interpret that as we understand that customer is happy. And that's kind of a built-in thing for us. Well, with the graphics and stuff that you were talking about, that becomes much, much easier with modern technologies. And you can do it in pretty much any UI, but I find that the more complex that the layout needs to be, the easier it is to use native technologies to make that into a nice, coherent experience.
Yeah, so drawing a smiley face like that, now we would use an icon to do that, or a typeface to do that. It's one of the simplest ways to do that nowadays. But we've had to, in the past, you would have had to draw that. And that's one of the benefits that desktop development has had for a long time. Maybe not so much anymore, because with web development especially, there's a whole bunch of new graphics tools. But the ability to be able to draw that circle, and I can't see what we got there. It's like a little smiley curve.
Yeah, but here's the thing. I mean, they did, I think, kind of use a simple icon, but we're not restricted to that with modern technologies. Let's bring up another example. Let's see if we can get to my demos for this. If you think about, for example, let's see, graphics, other function. Let's do that. There it is. So I did this example. I don't know. You could see 2012 was kind of the original thing that I did on it. And this application was done as a sample for somebody, and they did kind of do some things not too different from this. And it's got smiley faces in it too. But notice something that we can do with modern technologies, because to be honest, I don't use icons for anything anymore, except a few special cases. Almost everything I want to do is going to be vector-based. So, and I probably should, in a moment, bring up kind of how I get some of these vectorized things that we do. Let's bring this guy up here and see. So there's smiley faces, but all the smiles are different. They all reflect a number. So this guy's really unhappy. There's a -95 for him. This guy's really happy. He's got a 91. He's mildly unhappy. That's a -45. In other words, I've got this number that represents customer satisfaction, but I can bind the nature of the graphic, the amount of the smile. I can bind that to a number so that the smile dynamically changes depending on the number for that particular that particular person. So that's the reason I tend not to use icons. I tend to use vector-based shapes, because then I can use the advanced data binding.
So what you're saying, what I'm hearing you say is that, let me get screen shared here. So what you're saying is that you could use an icon or typeface for this, but you're restricted to a subset of what
Yeah,
10 smiley faces.
10 smiley
Whereas,
faces at various levels or something, and I
right,
pick
and
out the
then
one that I want.
this one you're saying I can design it myself, and that curve of the lips here is done to programming, or in your case, you said data binding.
It's data binding, yeah, with a little, it's a little converter that basically takes that number from -100 to +100 and turns it into a transformation factor on, and so I only have one shape. I only have the overall smiley face with the eyes and the smile, and I make the smile bigger or smaller depending upon the individual, that particular record's satisfaction index. And then I think at -75, I kick in the angry eyebrows. I make them kind of, that's either show or don't show. But see, that to me is the flexibility of not having to depend upon any bitmap graphics. We generally stay away from bitmap graphics in almost all the apps we do now.
Right, same here. It's like, well, they're good for like backgrounds.
Yeah,
and they're good for showing photographs, picture people's faces, and that, you know, it's nice to have the ability to put those in your application. But you're saying any sort of programmatic showing of data.
Yeah, yeah. Let me show you. I'll show you another example.
You're just full of examples today.
It's not as if I haven't been using this technology since 2006.
And it's not like you don't. I'm guessing that one of the things you do is you sit around and you think about how I can make a better UI.
Yeah. Well, I get challenged on how you make a better UI from from real clients. That the customers will come to me and say, "We got this problem to solve." I'll sit with the users, I'll see what they're doing, and then try to come up with a way using the technology to match that particular user's needs. So yeah, I'm always thinking about it. Sometimes for sessions, sometimes for real users. That first one that you just saw was for an actual project we were working on with real users in 2012. But the one I'm going to show you here was actually done to demonstrate something in a session to kind of help people see what the possibilities in the technology were. Let's see if we got that up. Yeah, it's coming up. So
it's coming up.
Yeah,
I'm working on getting it on the screen.
Yeah, let's see if I can't show it real quickly here. And notice over there, look at the Solution Explorer. There's not that much stuff in it. This is planes at gates. And notice that they're different colored and they're at different angles. So if I tell this one to go over to gate 10, let's put this stuff in there. Then he'll just slide right over there and he'll change his angle. Now, so I've got this entire thing showing gates, and you notice that the planes are all shaded based on how close they are to taking off and things like that. You want to make a guess about how long it took me to write this example?
Well, knowing you and knowing you wrote this in WPF, I'm guessing.
I did. I wrote this in WPF.
And you've been doing WPF development for a long
time.
I'm going to say it took you an hour.
Hour and 15 minutes. To do the entire thing. I woke up with the idea, and I had a session at I think 11, and I wrote this app that this little example for the session. Now I talked about the using the graphics. The planes, of course, are a vectorized shape, and we can see where we get it. If whoops, see.
Yeah, Metro Studio, one of my favorite tools.
Yeah, I bet you've used that. And if you use Metro Studio, then you can go get these graphics. And by the way, if you don't have Metro Studio and you want to get it, just look for a Metro Studio download or something, search for that, and you'll find it. And they don't charge for it. They do require an email address. So you have to give that to them, but they don't spam you. They're really, really good about not spamming you. They send you an activation code. So if I put in plane right here, then there's a bunch of planes, including this is the one I used in the app. Right here. And if I go here, you can either get, and by the way, the web folks can use this too, because you can get SVG versions of the plane with the path. But of course, for me, it's XAML. So there's the path that makes an airplane. And what I did was take that, and then you can see that there's the fill right here. there's the fill for the XAML. They've got a hard-coded color. Well, I just made that bindable. I sent that through a value converter that would grab a color based on how close the plane was to take it off.
And so, that you're using a feature of WPF is that once you put this path in there, you can make the fill, that hexadecimal value there. You just put that in a binding, then you pull that data, or you convert. You have a converter. Is that what you said?
Yeah, it's a value converter. You could do it in a view model too.
Yeah,
that would be yet another way to do it. So for me, having all that kinds of flexibility to be able to do these things very quickly, and depend upon sort of the graphics, the vector-based graphics, is a lot of those things that I do are feasible if I went to a browser. It's just that it would take so long, I wouldn't have the patience to actually do it. And I think a lot of people are in that boat, that you look at stuff like that. There are a few very high-end companies that are able to do it because they throw quite a lot of programming resources at it. But for me, it's an hour and a half or less to get some of these things out. So to me, that makes it practical where it wouldn't be before.
And one of the things that's interesting for me when you were talking about data binding is I think back, one of the things Microsoft has tried to do over the years in Windows Forms and in web forms early. Nobody likes web forms anymore, but you have to remember in 2001, too, that was pretty revolutionary. Yeah. One of the things that Microsoft's always tried to do is make it easy for developers to get data from their data source, whatever it was, into the application. And one of the things they did early on was data binding, which has gone through many iterations, right? And what's interesting to me is WPF and UWP both have really good versions of data binding. The way I think the mental model you use for that's great, but it's interesting for me to see that idea of binding has moved into all sorts of web frameworks. Yeah. It's like, okay, this is an idea that resonates with developers, and we can make it easy so other companies and other framework developers try to use the same, something similar is what I'm saying.
It's clear that Angular took a lot of inspiration from XAML data binding. And I think they implement probably 40%-ish of the data binding in XAML. It's a pretty good amount. They cover all the common cases, and they do a pretty good job of that. And then there's some interesting advanced cases. For example, that jump list control. Did I show the jump list control yet?
You have not showed it yet. You showed it to me in the pre-show while we were warming up.
Yeah, that was an example of sort of advanced data binding, because let's bring that one up.
All right.
Another example.
Do that.
Oh yeah, gosh, it's I got to get to the right. That's in an old version of Visual Studio, so I got to get to the right one. And it's another example of kind of all the desktop technologies I work with now. UWP and Uno platform and WPF can all do this. And I'm still fine actually with Windows Forms. I don't really try to talk people out of into moving off Windows Forms unless they've got some good reasons to do it. And we probably ought to spend a few minutes talking a little bit about sort of the state of that era if we're going to talk about desktop stuff.
Well, but talk about what? Talking about
the sort of the state, the Windows Forms, and sort of the state of why you might move off of it or why you might stay where you are, because with it moving into .NET Core, it's got some lifespan left in it too, but it doesn't allow me to do things like, well, I guess
it's interesting to me because like nobody, when you go to a conference or you see any of the new stuff coming from Microsoft, it's Windows Forms for years has been like, well, let's not talk about it. It's old technology. Yeah. And I worked in Windows Forms, and one of the things that really lit my fire when WPF came out is I'd done a bunch of Windows Forms development, and the rendering engine, you remember this, Billy, back then, the rendering engine underlying Windows Forms is GDI.
Yeah, yep.
And GDI Plus in one of the later versions.
Well, yeah, that was kind of the wrapper around GDI for Windows Forms.
Right, and then so we would, if you wanted to do anything custom graphics, you had to do what was called owner draw.
Owner draw, yes. I did about 4 or 5 owner draw projects.
I did too, and I did one for a legal firm, and they basically wanted to create something that looked like the ribbon for Office for their app.
Yeah.
And they already had developers that were working on it, but they brought me in because they couldn't figure out how to draw certain things in there. I ended up drawing that all with GDI calls. and it was
Oh,
tedious,
oh,
and it was error prone. And when WPF came out, the preview of WPF came out in 2007.
I think previews in 2006 because I was
Yeah.
starting to do some sessions
Well, I
because it was
saw that.
actually released in 2007 with Vista.
Yeah, when I saw the previews of that, and I saw that they were using DirectX as the rendering
Yeah,
engine, and that they were giving the programmers basically sort of a direct access into that drawing model, and
yeah,
like, this is so much easier than what I've been doing with
oh yeah,
GDI.
yeah.
So that's when I said, I'm done. I'm abandoning it, and I just jumped full footed
Full, yeah.
into WPF. But back to what I was saying, it's like, that's not the new Windows Forms is not the new thing. But there's still you and I know there's still a lot of developers out there that have, or shops that have, Windows Forms applications.
There are huge numbers of them, and in many cases, they've done so much. They've got such investment in it. They don't really see a clear reason to move forward. Developing some of that stuff was really hard, and the UI probably isn't nearly as good as we could do it with modern technologies. But the users have kind of figured it out already, and so the cost of moving forward doesn't necessarily balance the benefit they would get out of it in their eyes. Now, I think you could easily make an argument, because I've got spreadsheets to calculate return on investment for UX design. I think you could make a good argument that economically it does make sense to move forward for a majority of those people, but they themselves don't necessarily see that. And I think, Walt, I don't know how you feel about this, but I get the impression that when it comes to desktop technologies like that and rebuilding desktop apps, some of them have tried web stuff and realize it's just a completely different world. And they also see the rapid evolution of the industry. That uncertainty kind of seems to have frozen them in place. They're kind of afraid to invest because they're afraid that they will not invest well. Do you
I see that? And our guest next week is Rocky Latka, and he's got a lot of he's written a lot of articles about the fact that when you do enterprise development, or when you write an application for a business, you have a long-term expectation of return on investment. If we're going to spend $2.5 million building this app, then we expect the lifetime of that application to be 8 to 10 years.
Yeah.
And so an app that was written in Windows Forms in 2007, 10 years later, that's 2017. So that's that one. So maybe 3 years ago, they started thinking about, well, what do I do next? And up until quite recently, the web was really volatile.
Yeah.
So not web so much, but the frameworks and
all the frameworks. Yeah.
So that was really volatile. So like, do I bet on what, like Angular and React are popular now? But they weren't even 5 years ago. So
yeah. So I think there's still a fair amount of uncertainty in the sense that these frameworks have settled down from where they were 4 or 5 years ago, but they still evolve pretty rapidly. And there's kind of a natural life cycle to all technologies. I think of Classic VB as coming in online in 91, and by 98 it was the most popular programming tool on the planet. And then .NET came out and Java came out, and it started this downward trend. And so by 2005 or 2010, you just didn't do Classic VB anymore. And Windows Forms went through that. The web became very popular, circa 20 years ago, and has gone through a couple of good iterations. But I think we're starting to see some pressure now as we move into this distributed cloud-based 3D world, that it's kind of starting to see the cracks in that as a pervasive platform. All these platforms stay around for a long time after they're the default conventionalism platform, but at some point other things start to come in. So you look at all of the different platforms that have been launched in the last couple of years. You got Google Flutter, and you've got the Uno platform, and there's this platform called Coney, and I'm trying to remember another one, another low-code platform. There's about, I've got a list somewhere, about half a dozen of them. These people wouldn't be investing money in a lot of those platforms if they didn't think that the state of the world was changing pretty rapidly. So I see a lot of change coming, and I think that freezes a lot of people. They look at not just what's going on in the web world, but also what's going on sort of globally in software development. they get scared. So they just kind of, well, gosh, let's see if we can milk another year or two out of this Windows Forms.
Well, especially if you make the wrong bet. If you make the wrong bet on a technology, I've gone into companies as a consultant that had picked something, and then a year or two down the road, had realized that there was something better, but now they've got X number of portions of the application written in that.
People lose their jobs over stuff like that if they make a really bad decision. So yeah, we ought to probably talk a little bit about some of what's going on in the Windows Forms world at some point. I think there are probably people in the audience who would want to know.
This is a good time to bring up our next guest. So next week we have Rocky Lotka is going to be on, and I know for one he's got a lot of opinions about lifetimes of applications and why you should pick a platform that's going to be stable.
Yeah.
And Windows operating systems, or any operating system for that matter, have longer lifetimes than frameworks do.
Yeah.
And so there's that. But he's also, I know he's a big believer in Blazor, and that.
Well, it's more that he's a big believer in WebAssembly, and Blazor is, of course, the most prominent implementation that runs on it. So, and because he's been talking about WebAssembly now for a couple of years since it first sort of started getting floated. He feels like you need the access to the native stuff, that the stuff that the browser doesn't do, but you'd like to still get as much of the reach as you can. So we'll have to really press him on sort of what that balance is next week.
Let's not put words in his mouth. Let him speak to it. And because I personally, I believe WebAssembly is really important too. And I think it's not just for Blazor, but I think there's going to be a lot of pretty much any company that creates a compiler. Compiles code down is probably looking at how can we turn our compiler technology into writing for WebAssembly, and that's going to change a lot of things. I mean, I think the web world is going to be a lot different in 10 years.
It's hard for me to express how excited I am about writing my website, which I've recently begun poking at, in XAML and having it expressed on the Uno platform into WebAssembly.
We should get somebody from Uno on the program too.
Yeah, I need to talk to some of those folks because I'm on pretty good terms with them, and it's because I get the kind of advanced UI that I'm used to and the kind of productivity in doing the advanced UI, but it runs in the browser as well as running on iOS and Android and Windows. So yeah, see, I have this grand vision in the cloud world that every major platform shift has changed the way we develop software. You think about character-based to client-server stuff in the 90s, and you go from that into the internet era in the early 2000s, and now from that into the cloud era. Every transition we make really dramatically changes the way we do things. And I've got this vision of that we write software and it goes to whatever devices it needs to, and there's enough intelligence to make it run in the various environments that we need it to run in without us having to spend so much time trying to write an app for iOS and write a Windows desktop program and then write a web page to get to certain parts of it, which I think developers really want to focus on one technology, which is one of the strengths of the web stuff. And the reason a lot of people adopted it is, well, we only got to do this one thing. We can write our corporate applications. We can write our public-facing websites. We can write our mobile apps. We can kind of run our browser on the mobile. And the variations between those, technologically speaking, are pretty small. I think from a developer perspective, that's one of the attractions for that environment.
I think I agree with that. And you know, the early days of the web, when I first looked at CSS and HTML, I thought that was very fascinating too. When it came to, I'm less enamored with the way that a lot of development is done now, like let's write everything in JavaScript and forget about CSS, and or dynamically generate the CSS and dynamically generate the HTML, and that reminds me of well, it's a lot of bad memories of old software projects. So I had one more question for you before we go. I've seen some of your conference talks, and you often talk about cognitive science.
Yep.
And how does that help you build better applications?
Well, if you understand actually what the users perceive when they see a screen, that really helps you avoid doing things wrong and highlights the ways to do it right. There are just enormous examples, and we could probably do a little example every week. But the basic.
Let's do that. Let's do like a tip of the week.
Yeah.
We'll do like a tip of just like a couple minutes where you show an example of good UI and bad UI and what cognitive science says about that, why one is better than the other.
And probably the biggest single area where people get it wrong, and they get it wrong continuously, is they make their screens too crowded, and they think that there aren't any good alternatives to that everybody just wants all the information on the screen. Well, in fact, that's really working against people's cognitive systems, and there are better ways of doing it. So yeah, I probably need to show some examples of that, because when I talk about things in UX stuff, and that's the ability to show people exactly what they need works very naturally in the desktop arena, because we have a very stateful environment, and we can create new UI elements on the fly on the client and present them. We can switch what people are seeing it's much easier to build dynamic UI that's extremely responsive and switching things in and out. That's much easier to do with desktop technologies than this with browser-based stuff, because you keep having to go back to the browser to refresh portions of the screen, and that's not quite as responsive. Plus the fact that now it's really much easier to do it within a particular section, whereas with native technologies, we can layer things. We can get a new element that just layers all over the entire UI that we're working with. So yeah, I'll see if I can't draw up a list of tips of UI stuff.
And then you have like one book you'd recommend that like really helps understand the whole cognitive science thing?
There are a few books, but the one that I like the best, that I really recommend, is called Designing with the Mind in Mind. It's by a neurobiologist, Dr. Jeff Johnson, and it's just a fascinating book. It's in its second edition, and I used a lot of those examples in that session that you talked about, that I show how people actually see things. So yeah, I think that's a good thing to look at, and to stimulate people's understanding of why you want to do things a certain way and how you use color more effectively. Because I see developers, I've gone into clients who started using WPF, and it's amazing how ugly they can make the interface and think they're improving it with garish gradients and page turning animations and all kinds of gratuitous things.
So, but what I'm hearing you say is that you and I can have an opinion that this is ugly, or this is pretty, or this is useful. But what you're saying, what I'm hearing you say, is that by reading this book, you can find out how the brain perceives the information, how our eyes
and the visual
and our visual system perceive it, and then you can go to those developers and not say, "Look, this is ugly," because that's it's insulting. It's not that it's ugly. It's like there are better ways of presenting this information, and here's the science behind it. So let's modify your UI based on these principles, and then it's not intimidating and it's not condescending. It's a better way.
Yeah, because it's not just a matter of taste at that point. It's a matter of, here's some of the science behind it. And developers, that's especially important for developers, because people who work in the design space in general tend to be kind of have an emotional, intuitive sense of what they do. And developers don't go for that. I mean, developers, it's like you have to give reasons for it. You have to sort of explain it in terms of science or something that makes sense to them. And that book does a really good job of that.
Well, this has been great. We are at time for the episode. Thank you so much. I'm really happy that you're my co-host in this series, and looking forward to talking to Rocky next week.
Okay, we'll have some fun next week, and I'll get around to showing that jump list thing next week. So I don't mean to leave people hanging, but it'll take a little while to go through it. So.
All right, and be sure and follow. Let me get this up, our banner up. Be sure and follow either Billy or follow my account, because that's where you get the notifications. But even
turn it off. Sorry.
Or even better is follow the desktop show. There's a typo in there. Desktop Dev Show hashtag. Let me fix that. While we're getting ready to close, I'll hide that and edit it live in the app. You back, Billy?
Yeah, I'm back. Oh, one other thing we need to take up pretty soon, because I saw a question on this, is we need to talk a little bit about WinUI and some of the things that are coming out of that, because that's very current, and it plays into the idea of making your user interfaces better.
And Mike Neiman Ross says, what about COBOL? and that's a topic. I don't know if we're going to ever have that on the show, Mark, but we'll see.
I don't know COBOL. I'm sorry. I'm ignorant there. Although I understand that the New Jersey Department of Unemployment Security Processing needs COBOL programmers. So
probably that's why he's referring to that. Anyway, we're out of time, so we'll talk to you next week.
All right. Thanks, Walt. Talk to you then.
Bye.